Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Kansas Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The Holloway farm stood at the edge of civilization in Douglas County, Kansas Territory, 1890. A time when the prairie wind carried whispers of opportunity and the endless horizon promised new beginnings. But as local records would later reveal, some promises were made to be broken, and some hospitality came with a price that guests never anticipated paying. The two-story farmhouse sat isolated on 30 acres of grassland, approximately 7 miles outside of Lawrence. Records from the county clerk's office describe it as a substantial dwelling of reasonable appointment, with a barn of matching construction and several outbuildings of lesser quality. What those official documents failed to mention was how the house seemed to watch travelers who passed on the nearby trail, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. According to land records filed at the Douglas County Courthouse, Silas Holloway purchased the property in 1882, using funds that seemed disproportionate to his previously documented income as a former railway worker. The source of this sudden wealth was never officially questioned. Such matters rarely were in the rapidly expanding Western territories, where men's pasts often remained conveniently obscured by the dust of distance. By all accounts, Silas was a reserved man of approximately 50 years, with a neatly trimmed beard that had gone prematurely white. His wife, Martha, 8 years his junior, was described in a Lawrence Weekly Tribune Society column as a woman of pleasant countenance, though quiet disposition, who rarely ventures into town. The couple had no children. What made the Holloway property unusual was its position. Unlike most homesteads, which clustered near water sources or townships, the Holloway farm stood in deliberate isolation, yet remained tantalizingly visible from the Lawrence-Topeka Trail. At night, lantern light from its windows served as a beacon for weary travelers, many of whom, according to local accounts, were invited to rest there before continuing their journey. The first documented disappearance connected to the property occurred in April 1888. A businessman from St. Louis named Edward Chambers was reported missing by associates in Topeka when he failed to arrive for a scheduled meeting. According to the Topeka Capital Journal's April 18, 1888 edition, Chambers had set out from Lawrence 2 days prior, a journey that should have taken no more than a day by horseback. The Lawrence Constabulary conducted what was described as a perfunctory search along the trail, but with no evidence of foul play and the common understanding that many travelers simply abandoned their intended routes to seek fortune elsewhere, the case was quickly closed. Chambers became merely another name on the growing list of those who vanished into the vastness of the American frontier. Had that been the only disappearance, perhaps the Holloway farm would have remained nothing more than an unremarkable homestead. But as county records would later reveal, between 1888 and 1890, no fewer than 7 individuals were reported missing along the stretch of trail that passed the Holloway property. The peculiarity of these disappearances was not immediately apparent to authorities. The West was still wild, and people vanished with regularity, claimed by harsh elements, hostile encounters, or simply the anonymous promise of new identities in distant territories. What eventually drew attention to the pattern was not the disappearances themselves, but rather the curious economic transformation of the Holloway farm. According to tax assessments filed with the county, the Holloway property showed remarkable improvements between 1888 and 1890. A new well was dug. The barn was expanded. Livestock holdings increased from 2 horses and 3 cows to a considerable operation of 12 horses, 15 cattle, and an assortment of other animals. The house itself received a new wing, the construction of which was noted by the Lawrence Weekly Tribune as an unexpected expansion for a household of modest means and no apparent increase in family size. Where this newfound prosperity originated became a subject of quiet speculation among the citizens of Lawrence. Some suggested that Silas had discovered gold on his property, a rumor he neither confirmed nor denied when it occasionally reached his ears during his monthly trips into town for supplies. Others believed he might have been engaged in some manner of illicit trade, perhaps running a smuggling operation, using his isolated property as a way station. The truth, as it often does, remained hidden beneath layers of rural privacy and the accepted understanding that a man's business was his own until the spring of 1890, when a distinctive pocket watch appeared on Silas Holloway's vest during a visit to the Lawrence General Store. The timepiece was gold, with an ornate engraving of a steam locomotive on its cover, precisely matching the description of a watch that had belonged to Edward Chambers, the Snaint, Lewis businessman who had vanished 2 years earlier. This detail might have gone unnoticed had Frederick Reynolds, a traveling salesman who had known Chambers, not been present in the store that day. According to Reynolds's subsequent statement to the county sheriff, he immediately recognized the distinctive timepiece, but held his tongue until Holloway had departed. His suspicion, once voiced to the store proprietor and eventually to law enforcement, set in motion the events that would ultimately reveal the dark secret of the Holloway farm. Sheriff William Donovan, described in county records as a man of methodical temperament and considerable experience with the varied forms of frontier justice, did not rush to conclusions. The pocket watch alone was insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. It could have been purchased, found, or acquired through any number of legitimate means. Instead, Donovan began a quiet investigation, reviewing the records of reported disappearances and noting with growing concern that each missing person had last been seen on the Lawrence-Topeka Trail, and each had been carrying items of value, cash, jewelry, quality horses, or merchandise. On May 12, 1890, Sheriff Donovan and 3 deputies approached the Holloway farm under the pretense of investigating cattle rustling in the area. What they found was a property that showed none of the outward signs typically associated with frontier criminality. The house was well maintained, the fields properly tended. Martha Holloway offered them coffee, which they politely declined. According to the sheriff's official report, preserved in the Kansas Historical Society archives, nothing seemed immediately amiss until Deputy James Harrington noticed a collection of personal effects in the barn that seemed unusually diverse for a single household. Different styles of boots neatly arranged on a shelf, several saddles of varying quality and wear, and, most tellingly, a small trunk containing men's clothing of different sizes. When questioned, Silas explained that he purchased such items when their original owners passed through and found themselves short of cash. Many a traveler will part with possessions rather than delay their journey, he was recorded as saying. I provide a fair price and the service of relieving them of burdens they'd rather not continue carrying. The explanation might have sufficed had Deputy Harrington not also discovered, partially concealed beneath a false floorboard in the tack room, a leather folio containing business papers belonging to Edward Chambers. The documents, dated February 1888, included contracts that would have been valuable only to Chambers himself or someone attempting to assume his business interests. Confronted with this evidence, Sheriff Donovan ordered a thorough search of the property. What they discovered in the following hours transformed a suspicious circumstance into one of the most disturbing cases in Kansas territorial history. Behind the barn, in an area that had been used for slaughtering livestock, the soil was found to contain human remains. Initial excavation revealed the partial remains of at least 3 individuals, all bearing signs of violent death. Further investigation would eventually uncover a total of 9 sets of remains in various locations around the property. According to the coroner's report filed on May 17, 1890, the victims had been killed by blunt force trauma to the cranium, likely delivered from behind with a heavy implement such as a hammer or pry bar. Several of the remains showed evidence of having been partially burned before burial, presumably in an attempt to destroy identifying features or evidence. Martha Holloway, when confronted with these discoveries, reportedly displayed no emotion beyond a slight tightening of her thin lips. According to Deputy Harrington's personal journal, which was later donated to the Kansas Historical Society, she simply stated, "A farm demands certain sacrifices. The soil here was poor when we arrived. It needed enrichment." The full extent of the Holloway's crimes emerged only gradually through careful examination of the recovered remains and comparison with reports of missing persons. The pattern that emerged was as practical as it was horrifying. The Holloways, it appeared, had developed a system. They would observe travelers on the nearby trail, assessing those who appeared to be carrying valuables or riding quality horses. After dark, a lantern would be placed in the upstairs window of their home, a beacon of supposed hospitality for weary journeyers. Those who accepted the invitation to shelter for the night would be fed, provided with comfortable accommodations, and engaged in conversation that carefully extracted information about their destination, connections, and whether anyone would miss them should they fail to arrive. According to Martha's eventual testimony, transcribed in the court records of Douglas County, the decision about a guest's fate was made during these conversations. Silas had an instinct, she stated. He could tell which ones wouldn't be missed. Those were the ones who never saw morning. The method was always the same. The guest would be shown to the spare bedroom on the ground floor. Once asleep, Silas would enter with a mining hammer, kept specifically for this purpose, delivering a single, fatal blow. The body would then be moved to the barn, where it would be systematically stripped of all valuables and identifying features. Martha's role, according to her own cold recounting, was to clean the guest room so thoroughly that not a speck of the previous occupant remained. By morning, there would be no evidence that anyone had ever visited. The Holloways would then appropriate the victim's possessions, sometimes selling items in distant towns, sometimes incorporating them into their own holdings. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of a ledger, found hidden in a compartment beneath the kitchen floorboards. In it, Martha Holloway had meticulously recorded each victim, not by name, but by date and estimated value of their possessions. Next to some entries were notations about the quality of the soil where they were buried, as if they were evaluating which areas of the farm benefited most from this grotesque form of enrichment. What was perhaps most chilling about the ledger was its clinical precision. Martha Holloway, who had only received 3 years of formal education according to census records, demonstrated a remarkable aptitude for bookkeeping when it came to documenting their crimes. Each entry was dated, with neat columns detailing the estimated value of different categories of items: currency, jewelry, clothing, equipment, and livestock. A final column contained cryptic notations about burial locations, using a simple grid system that corresponded to different sections of the farm. Some entries contained additional notes. Next to the entry for May 7, 1889, believed to correspond to the disappearance of a cattle buyer from Wichita, Martha had written, "Too thin. Barely worth the trouble, but S insisted." The entry for August 23rd of the same year, which investigators later connected to a missing land speculator, read simply, "Fat. Good soil response expected." These notations suggested a disturbing perspective on their victims, viewing them not as people, but as resources to be harvested, their wealth to be collected, and their bodies to serve as fertilizer. This utilitarian approach to murder was reflected in Martha's courtroom testimony, during which she reportedly showed no remorse or moral recognition of wrongdoing. "We took what would otherwise have been wasted," she told the court, according to transcripts. "These men were passing through. Their money would have been spent. Their possessions would have deteriorated. We gave them purpose. The farm flourished because of them." The case against the Holloways was built not only on physical evidence, but also on the testimony of Luther Bridges, a cattle drover, who had stayed at the farm in early 1890, but had, due to insomnia, remained awake when Silas entered his room. The ensuing struggle had resulted in Bridges escaping with minor injuries. He had reported the incident in Topeka, but had been largely dismissed as having misinterpreted a host checking on his guest. Bridges' testimony, recorded during the preliminary hearing and preserved in court documents, described how Martha had stood in the doorway during his struggle with Silas, holding a lantern and commenting only, "Be quick about it. The night grows short." The attack had occurred around 3 in the morning, according to Bridges. He had been unable to sleep due to a toothache and was sitting up in bed when the door to his room opened slowly. "At first I thought perhaps they had heard me stirring and were bringing something for the pain," Bridges testified. "But then I saw the hammer in Silas's hand, and the look in his eyes. Not angry, not excited, just calculating. The struggle that ensued was brief, but violent. Bridges, a man of considerable physical strength from years of working with cattle, managed to deflect the first blow and grapple with his attacker. During the struggle, he described seeing Martha in the doorway, holding a lantern high, her expression one of annoyance rather than alarm or shame. She didn't say, 'Stop,' or 'What are you doing?'" Bridges recalled. She said, "Be quick about it. The night grows short." Like she was talking about slaughtering a hog that was taking too long to die. Bridges eventually broke free, escaping through the bedroom window and fleeing on foot across the dark prairie. He reached a neighboring farm shortly before dawn, his clothes torn and his face bloodied from the fight, and his desperate run through the night. The farmer who took him in, Joseph Miller, initially thought Bridges had been set upon by thieves on the trail and was skeptical of his story about the seemingly respectable Holloways. Nevertheless, Miller transported Bridges to Topeka the following day, where he reported the incident to local authorities. The Topeka sheriff, without jurisdiction in Douglas County and dubious of the tale, simply noted the report and suggested that perhaps Bridges had misinterpreted the situation, or that the Holloways had mistaken him for an intruder in the dark. This dismissal of Bridges' experience was typical of the period when law enforcement across the territories was stretched thin and inclined to minimize incidents that would require resources they didn't have. It wasn't until Sheriff Donovan's investigation began, following the discovery of Chambers' pocket watch, that Bridges' account was revisited and given the credence it deserved. By then, Bridges had continued on his cattle drive to Wichita, but when contacted by telegraph, he immediately returned to Lawrence to provide his testimony. His willingness to interrupt his business and travel back, a journey of considerable inconvenience and expense, lent additional weight to his account. During the trial, Bridges' testimony provided crucial insight into the Holloways' methodology and mindset. He described the careful way they had questioned him over dinner, asking about his family, his destination, and whether anyone was expecting him. At the time, he had interpreted their interest as simple frontier hospitality, the natural curiosity of isolated homesteaders hungry for news and human connection. In retrospect, he realized they had been assessing whether he would be missed if he disappeared. The only reason he had survived, he believed, was that he had mentioned a business partner waiting for him in Wichita who knew exactly where he had stopped for the night. "I remember Mrs. Holloway's face changed when I mentioned Mr. Delaney expecting me," Bridges testified. "Just a flicker across her eyes, like a cloud passing over the sun. Then she smiled and offered me more stew, but something had shifted. I didn't think much of it at the time." This testimony suggested that the Holloways were selective in their predation, choosing victims whose disappearances would be less likely to trigger intensive searches or draw attention to their operation. It was a calculated approach that had allowed them to continue their crimes undetected for years. Neither defendant showed remorse or offered explanation beyond Martha's chilling assertion that the land demanded tribute and we merely served as its collectors. The courtroom in Lawrence was packed throughout the proceedings, with citizens from throughout the county converging to witness what the Lawrence Daily Journal called the most sensational case of depravity ever to unfold in our region. Extra benches were brought in to accommodate the crowd, and according to newspaper Accounts many spectators were turned away for lack of space. The trial of Silas and Martha Holloway began on July 8, 1890, and lasted just 4 days. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. Judge Harmon Caldwell, who presided over the case, was described in contemporary accounts as visibly disturbed by the evidence presented. A seasoned jurist who had handled numerous murder trials during his 15 years on the bench, Caldwell reportedly confided to his clerk that the Holloway case revealed a darkness of soul I had not previously encountered in all my judicial experience. The prosecution, led by County Attorney Robert Chambers, no relation to the victim Edward Chambers, presented a methodical case that left little room for doubt. The physical evidence, the remains, the victim's possessions found on the property, the damning ledger, was supplemented by testimony from Luther Bridges and various Lawrence merchants who had observed the Holloway's suspicious increase in prosperity. Particularly compelling was the testimony of Abigail Winters, a seamstress from Lawrence who had been engaged to alter several garments for Martha Holloway in the spring of 1889. Mrs. Winters testified that she had noticed something unusual about the clothing. They were men's garments of varying sizes and qualities, some quite fine. When I inquired as to why Mrs. Holloway wanted them altered, she explained that she sold them to travelers who found themselves in need of replacement clothing. At the time, it seemed a reasonable explanation, if somewhat unusual for a farm wife. Mrs. Winters went on to describe how Martha had been particular about removing any monograms or identifying marks from the garments, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but took on sinister meaning in light of the murders. The defense, such as it was, offered little substantive challenge to the prosecution's case. The court-appointed attorney Thomas Bradford focused primarily on procedural matters and made a half-hearted attempt to suggest that the remains found on the property might have been those of travelers who had died of natural causes, whom the Holloways had buried out of convenience rather than reporting the deaths. This theory collapsed under the weight of forensic evidence, particularly the coroner's determination that each victim had suffered near-identical fatal injuries to the skull, inconsistent with natural death. Bradford's final argument to the jury amounted to little more than a plea for mercy based on the advanced age of the defendants, an appeal that fell on deaf ears given the calculated nature of the crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Caldwell, in delivering the sentence, departed from his usual judicial reserve. According to court transcripts, he addressed the Holloways directly. "In my years on this bench, I have seen many manifestations of humanity's capacity for wrongdoing. I have sentenced men who killed in anger, in jealousy, in fear, and in greed. But never have I encountered individuals who approached murder with such cold calculation, such absence of moral recognition, as you have displayed. You have not only taken lives, but have done so under the sacred guise of hospitality, turning what should be mankind's shelter against the wilderness into a trap for the unwary. For this perversion of the most basic human trust, and for the lives you have taken, there can be only one sentence." Both were found guilty and sentenced to hang. The execution was carried out on August 22, 1890, marking one of the few instances in Kansas territorial history where a woman was subjected to capital punishment. According to newspaper accounts, neither Holloway spoke a word on the gallows. They went to their deaths with the same quiet efficiency with which they had dispatched their victims. The Lawrence Daily Journal reported that approximately 300 people gathered to witness the execution, which took place in the yard behind the county courthouse. The paper described the crowd as solemn rather than rowdy, the usual carnival atmosphere of public executions notably absent in the face of crimes so disturbing they subdued even the most hardened spectators. Martha Holloway was hanged first, followed by her husband. Witnesses reported that neither prisoner resisted or showed emotion as they were led to the gallows. The executioner, brought in from Kansas City for the occasion, later told a reporter that in his 15 years of performing such duties, he had never seen two people face the noose with such complete indifference. This apparent lack of emotional response at their arrest, throughout their trial, and at their execution became a subject of particular fascination for early criminologists who later studied the case. Dr. James Pritchard, writing in the American Journal of Criminal Psychology in 1913, suggested that the Holloways represented a rare example of moral insensibility, individuals whose outward conformity to social norms masked a complete absence of internal moral compass. What makes the Holloway case so disturbing, Pritchard wrote, is not merely the acts they committed, but the matter-of-fact manner in which they integrated these acts into an otherwise conventional existence. They maintained their farm, interacted with neighbors, observed social proprieties, all while systematically murdering their guests and recording the profits in a ledger as one might track crop yields. In the aftermath, the Holloway farm was seized by the county. No buyers came forward, the property's grim history rendering it effectively worthless. The house was eventually dismantled, its materials used for various municipal projects in Lawrence. The barn was burned. The land itself remained uncultivated for decades, with local farmers referring to it simply as the bad ground. The dismantling of the Holloway house became a community effort, though not one undertaken with any sense of celebration. According to an account in the Lawrence Weekly Tribune dated September 15, 1890, men from throughout the county gathered to take apart the structure, working in silence under an unseasonably cold rain. There was none of the usual banter that accompanies such collective labor, the newspaper reported. The men worked methodically as if performing a necessary but unpleasant duty. Several refused to enter certain rooms of the house, particularly the guest bedroom where so many had met their end. The materials salvaged from the house were used in various civic projects. The foundation stones were repurposed for a retaining wall along the Kansas River, the timber for repairs to the courthouse stable. No single structure was built from the remains of the Holloway house. As if by unspoken agreement, the community had decided that the materials should be dispersed, their connection to the crimes diluted through distribution. The barn, however, was not repurposed. On October 3, 1890, it was burned to the ground in what the county sheriff's report described as a controlled elimination of a structure deemed unsalvageable and potentially hazardous. Unofficial accounts suggest that the burning had a more ritualistic quality, with many of the same men who had dismantled the house gathering to watch the barn consumed by flames. According to local folklore, preserved in the oral histories collected by the Kansas Historical Society in the 1950s, one elderly resident recalled her father returning from the barn, burning and washing his hands repeatedly throughout the evening. When asked why, he reportedly answered, "Some dirt doesn't show, but you feel it just the same." The land itself became the subject of superstition and avoidance. Though technically owned by Douglas County after the seizure, no attempt was made to sell the property for nearly 30 years. It remained untended, the fields returning to prairie grass, the orchard that Martha had so carefully cultivated slowly dying from neglect. Neighboring farmers refused to allow their livestock to graze on the property even during the drought of 1894, when pasturage was scarce. One farmer, Jacob Himes, whose property adjoined the former Holloway land, was recorded in his journal as saying, "Better to slaughter the cattle for lack of feed than let them eat from that ground. What grew there was fed by wrong." A comprehensive study of the case was undertaken by Professor Thomas Whitfield of the University of Kansas in 1962. His monograph, Predatory Hospitality, The Holloway Farm Murders of 1888-1890, established what is now considered the definitive academic account of the events. According to Whitfield's research, which included interviews with elderly residents who still remembered the case, the total number of victims may have been as high as 15, though only 9 sets of remains were ever recovered. Whitfield's research was remarkable for its thoroughness. He spent 3 years examining court records, newspaper accounts, personal journals, and conducting interviews with descendants of those involved in the case. His work was the first to systematically connect the known victims with reports of missing persons from the period, establishing a more complete picture of those who had fallen prey to the Holloways. Among Whitfield's most significant contributions was his discovery of Martha Holloway's family background, previously unexplored in accounts of the case. Through correspondence with historical societies in Ohio, he determined that Martha, née Carver, had been raised on a failing farm in Hamilton County, where her family had struggled with poor soil and mounting debt. This childhood experience of agricultural hardship, Whitfield wrote, may provide some context for her later fixation on enriching the soil of the Kansas property, though it cannot, of course, explain or excuse the horrific means by which she chose to address the challenge. Particularly notable was Whitfield's examination of the economic aspects of the crimes. Based on the Holloway's ledger and county tax records, he estimated that their murderous enterprise had yielded the equivalent of approximately $30,000 in modern currency, a considerable sum for the time, but hardly a fortune. The question that haunts this case, Whitfield wrote, is whether the financial gain was truly the primary motivation or merely a practical benefit derived from actions driven by deeper, darker impulses. Whitfield's research also uncovered previously unexplored connections between the Holloways and their victims. In at least 3 cases, Silas had visited the same Lawrence establishments as his future victims on the day before they disappeared: the general store, the bank, or the livery stable. This suggested that rather than simply waiting for travelers to pass by their property, the Holloways may have actively identified potential targets during their trips into town, perhaps assessing their wealth or determining whether they were traveling alone. This level of premeditation added another disturbing dimension to the case, suggesting that the crimes were not merely opportunistic but involved careful selection and planning. It also explained how the Holloways seemed to have an uncanny ability to identify travelers who would not be immediately missed. They had gathered this information in advance. The Holloway case faded from public memory relatively quickly, overshadowed by the rapid changes occurring throughout the territory as it progressed toward statehood. By the early 20th century, it had become little more than a footnote in Kansas criminal history, occasionally referenced in academic studies of frontier justice, but largely forgotten by the general public. This obscurity was in part due to deliberate choices by local authorities. According to Whitfield's research, the Douglas County Commissioners voted in 1895 to restrict access to the court records related to the case, citing concerns about the county's reputation. The Lawrence Chamber of Commerce, eager to attract investment as the new century approached, similarly discouraged mention of the case in local promotional materials. There was a concerted effort, Whitfield noted, to allow the Holloway murders to fade from public consciousness, an early example of what we might now call reputation management. The county and town officials recognized that their community's image could be tarnished by association with such notorious crimes. In 1968, during the construction of a highway that would pass near the former Holloway property, workers uncovered additional human remains that forensic examination suggested dated from the same period as the known murders. These findings lent credence to Whitfield's theory that the 9 victims identified during the original investigation represented only a portion of the Holloway's total victims. The 1968 discovery briefly revived public interest in the case. The Kansas City Star ran a feature article on August 18, 1968, titled "Dark Harvest: The Forgotten Murders of the Kansas Prairie," which summarized the original case and the new findings. The article quoted the state archaeologist Dr. Roland Peterson, who had examined the remains. The skeletal material is consistent with the historical record of the Holloway case. We have identified the remains of 2 adult males, both exhibiting cranial fractures similar to those described in the 1890 coroner's reports. The location, approximately a quarter mile from the original farmhouse site, suggests that the Holloways may have used multiple burial areas to distribute the evidence of their crimes. Following this discovery, the Kansas Historical Society funded a more comprehensive archaeological survey of the area, conducted in the spring of 1969. This investigation, while hampered by the intervening decades of agricultural activity and natural erosion, nevertheless identified 3 additional probable burial sites. Excavation of these sites yielded fragmentary remains and period artifacts, buttons, boot eyelets, a partial watch chain, consistent with the known victim profile. The most disturbing aspect of the case, perhaps, was not the murders themselves, horrific though they were, but rather the calculated normality with which the Holloways conducted both their crimes and their daily lives. Neighbors described them as quiet but not unusually so, private but not suspiciously reclusive. They attended the occasional community gathering, made their monthly trips into Lawrence for supplies, and even hosted the local minister for dinner once each year around Christmas. Reverend Thaddeus Grant, who served as minister of the Lawrence Methodist Episcopal Church from 1886 to 1892, provided a statement during the investigation that was particularly unsettling in retrospect. According to court records, he described his annual Christmas visits to the Holloway farm as pleasant occasions marked by Mrs. Holloway's excellent cooking and Mr. Holloway's reserved but adequate hospitality. Had I been asked before these revelations to describe the Holloways, Reverend Grant stated, I would have characterized them as solid, if somewhat undemonstrative, members of the community. There was nothing in their demeanor or conversation that would have suggested such darkness resided within them. Mrs. Holloway, in particular, spoke often of her garden and her efforts to improve the farm's productivity. In light of what we now know, such comments take on a grotesque new meaning. This veneer of ordinary rural life, maintained while systematically murdering travelers and burying them on their property, suggests a compartmentalization of moral understanding that defies conventional psychological categories. The Holloways appeared to view their actions not as transgressive or even particularly noteworthy, but simply as a practical method of improving their circumstances. Eleanor Simmons, writing in the Journal of Historical Criminology in 1965, suggested that this phrasing might indicate a perverse moral framework in which the Holloways viewed themselves not as murderers, but as servants of the land itself, collecting a tithe of human life that they believed the frontier demanded. This interpretation gained support from several entries in Martha's ledger, where she referred to particularly fertile areas of the farm as well-fed and noted with approval that crops planted over burial sites stand taller than their neighbors. In one entry from July 1889, she wrote, "The corn where the drummer lies grows green despite the dry spell." Martha's reference to the land demanding tribute has been the subject of particular scholarly interest. He gives back what the land gave him in life. Dr. Simmons proposed that this perspective represented a twisted variant of the period's frontier philosophy, the widely held belief that the land existed to be claimed, exploited, and made productive by those willing to endure its hardships. The Holloways, she wrote, simply extended this utilitarian view of the natural world to encompass human life as well, viewing travelers not as fellow beings but as resources to be harvested. This clinical detachment from the humanity of their victims was further evidenced by the way the Holloways disposed of personal effects that had no monetary value. According to the sheriff's report, a small valise found in the barn loft contained dozens of personal items, letters, photographs, a child's drawing, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, presumed to have belonged to various victims. These items, which held emotional rather than financial value, had been neither used nor discarded, but simply stored away like specimens. Each was wrapped in a scrap of newspaper dated around the time of the presumed murder, suggesting an archivist's attention to detail that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the crimes themselves. The Holloway farm case stands as a stark reminder of the dark possibilities that existed within the supposedly optimistic narrative of Western expansion. Behind the mythology of pioneering spirit and rugged individualism lurked the potential for isolation to transform ordinary human greed into something far more sinister. Historians of the American frontier have often noted how the physical isolation of homesteads created psychological conditions unlike those in more settled regions. Dr. Martin Bryce, in his 1972 study Darkness on the Prairie, Crime and Community in the Settlement Era, described the frontier as a context in which the normal social constraints that regulated behavior in established communities were weakened by distance and dispersal. In the absence of close neighbors, regular church attendance, frequent social interaction, and consistent law enforcement, Bryce wrote, individuals with already weak moral constraints might find themselves sliding incrementally into behaviors that would have been unthinkable in more populated settings. The frontier didn't create monsters, but it could unmake the civilized veneer that kept monstrous impulses in check. The Holloway case seems to exemplify this theory. Their farm's strategic isolation, visible from the trail but removed from neighbors who might observe unusual activities, created conditions where their crimes could continue undetected for years. The infrequent nature of travel in the region meant that disappearances were noticed only belatedly, if at all, and were easily attributed to the many natural hazards of frontier travel. Today, the location of the former Holloway property is marked only by a small historical plaque erected by the Kansas Historical Society in 1992. It makes no mention of the murders, stating only that the site was the location of a significant legal case in territorial history. The land itself has been reclaimed by prairie grasses, giving no indication of the horrors once enacted there. The plaque's understated text was the result of considerable debate within the Historical Society. According to minutes from their 1991 planning meetings, some members advocated for a more explicit acknowledgement of the site's dark history, arguing that historical accuracy demanded a clear statement of the murders that had occurred there. Others, including descendants of families who had lived in the area during the Holloway era, preferred a more oblique reference, concerned that an explicit memorial might attract macabre tourism or sensationalize tragedies that had caused genuine pain to the victims' families. The compromise text reflected this tension between historical transparency and respect for the dead. The highway that now passes within view of the former Holloway property carries thousands of travelers each day, few of whom are aware of what occurred in the seemingly unremarkable stretch of prairie visible from their windows. The land itself has been owned since 1974 by a conservation trust, which maintains it as part of a tallgrass prairie restoration project. Yet something of the Holloway's legacy persists in local memory, and some older farmers still avoid the area where the farm once stood, not out of any superstitious fear, but from a deep-seated aversion to soil that was, as one elderly resident put it in a 1967 interview, fed with the wrong kind of nourishment. This lingering discomfort with the land itself reflects what anthropologists have termed cultural memory of place, the way physical locations can retain associations with past events long after those events have faded from active remembrance. Residents of Douglas County still occasionally refer to unexpected windfalls as Holloway luck, a phrase whose dark origins have been largely forgotten by those who use it. Dr. Caroline Mercer, in her 2005 study of crime sites as cultural landmarks, noted that the Holloway farm represents a particularly pure example of site contamination in the cultural imagination, where the very soil is perceived as tainted by the acts committed upon it. Local folklore includes persistent stories about the property, tales of crops that grow strangely or fail entirely, of livestock that refuse to graze there, of unseasonable cold spots even on summer days. While easily dismissed as superstition, these narratives serve an important cultural function, marking the land as a place of historical transgression and maintaining a boundary between it and the surrounding community. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire case was revealed in Professor Whitfield's research when he discovered correspondence between Martha Holloway and her sister in Ohio, dated just 2 weeks before the crimes were discovered. The letter, preserved in the Kansas Historical Society archives, is remarkably mundane, discussing weather, crop prices, and Martha's plans to expand her kitchen garden. The final paragraph reads, "We continue to be blessed with occasional visitors, though the spring rains have made the trail muddy and reduced the number of travelers. Silas says we should not worry, as summer will bring many more guests passing through. The soil in the Northfield has responded particularly well to our attentions this past winter. The vegetables there grow with remarkable vigor. I believe we have finally found the right method of enrichment for this stubborn Kansas earth." The letter was never sent. It was found in Martha's sewing basket during the investigation, sealed and stamped, apparently forgotten in the press of more immediate concerns, like the disposal of their most recent victim, whose remains were found in the barn loft, not yet buried when Sheriff Donovan and his deputies arrived. What makes this letter so disturbing is not merely its content, which takes on horrific meaning when read with knowledge of the Holloway's crimes, but its utterly conventional tone. The handwriting, according to Whitfield's analysis, is neat and controlled. The paper is of good quality, the kind used for important correspondence. Martha had taken care with this communication, treating it as a normal exchange between sisters, even as the subject matter, obliquely referenced, involved murder and the use of human remains as fertilizer. Whitfield suggested that this letter provides the clearest window into Martha Holloway's psychology, revealing a mind capable of discussing grotesque acts in the same measured tones one might use to describe crop rotation or preserving techniques. "The horror," he wrote, "lies not in emotional disturbance, but in its absence, not in moral confusion, but in the calm replacement of conventional morality with a logic of utility that placed human life on the same level as any other resource to be harvested." In the decades that followed, the Holloway case influenced both legal practice and architecture in Kansas. County sheriffs began keeping more detailed records of travelers passing through their jurisdictions. Roadhouses and inns sprang up along major trails, offering regulated public alternatives to the private hospitality of isolated homesteads. And, perhaps most tellingly, many Kansas farmhouses built after 1890 featured windows that were deliberately positioned away from nearby roads, as if their owners wished to avoid any suggestion that they were watching for travelers or offering silent invitation to weary passers-by. These architectural changes were subtle but significant. Dr. Henry Abernathy, an architectural historian who studied prairie home design, noted in his 1983 monograph, Dwelling on the Plains, that post-Holloway farmhouses in eastern Kansas show a distinct shift in orientation. While earlier structures typically presented their most attractive facade to passing roads, later homes turned slightly away, positioning main entrances at angles that required deliberate approach rather than spontaneous visitation. This shift, Abernathy argued, reflected not merely practical concerns about safety, but a deeper cultural anxiety about the nature of frontier hospitality itself. The Holloway case forced a reconsideration of the open-door policies that had characterized Western settlement, he wrote. It suggested that the stranger at the door might pose a threat not only to the household that admitted him, the traditional fear, but that the household itself might be the true source of danger. The case also had lasting effects on legal procedure in Kansas. The perfunctory handling of Luther Bridges' initial report, dismissed by authorities in Topeka, despite clear evidence of attempted murder, prompted reforms in how such complaints were processed. In 1891, the territorial legislature passed what became informally known as Bridges' Law, requiring that all reports of violent crime be documented and shared with neighboring jurisdictions, regardless of where the alleged offense occurred. Additionally, the discovery that Silas Holloway had been quietly assuming some of his victims' business interests led to stricter requirements for verifying identity in property transfers and financial transactions. Banks in Lawrence and Topeka began requiring personal introductions from known customers before opening accounts for newcomers, and county clerks implemented more rigorous procedures for recording deeds and titles. The final chapter of the Holloway story was written in 1963, when the last known victim was identified through dental records preserved by a St. Louis medical practice. Jonathan Winthrop, a 38-year-old textile merchant, had disappeared in September 1889 while traveling to Topeka. His gold pocket watch, inscribed with his initials, was among the items found in the Holloway's possession. His remains, identified through a distinctive dental bridge, were among those discovered during the highway construction of 1968. Winthrop's great-niece, upon being notified of the identification, reportedly asked only one question: did he suffer? The official response, based on forensic evidence, was that death had likely been instantaneous. What remained unspoken was the terrible betrayal that preceded that death: the false welcome, the offered meal, the seemingly safe bed that became a trap. Winthrop's story, pieced together from business records and family correspondence, was sadly typical of the Holloway's victims. A widower with grown children, he had been traveling to Topeka to finalize the purchase of a small textile warehouse. He carried with him approximately $1,200 in bank drafts and cash, a substantial sum that appeared in Martha's ledger as September 17 Textiles, almost now $100, with the additional notation, quality timepiece, gold. What made Winthrop's case particularly poignant was the discovery, among the personal effects in the valise found in the barn, of a letter he had apparently been writing to his daughter. The partially completed letter, dated September 16, 1889, described his journey thus far and mentioned that he planned to accept the hospitality of a farm couple for the night, as the next stretch of trail looks unwelcoming in the gathering dusk, and my horse is weary. The letter ended mid-sentence, presumably interrupted when Winthrop was called to the evening meal that would be his last. This fragmentary communication, never sent and never completed, stands as a haunting reminder of the ordinary human lives that were cut short by the Holloway's calculated predation. In this lies perhaps the darkest element of the Holloway case, not just the taking of lives, but the perversion of hospitality itself, that most basic human exchange of safety and shelter. On the American frontier, where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers, the Holloways exploited this fundamental trust, transforming an act of human connection into an opportunity for predation. Dr. Francis Westover, a historian specializing in frontier communities, has argued that the Holloway case represented a particularly acute violation of frontier values. In her 2001 essay, Dark Hearth's Betrayal and Boundary in the Settlement Era, she wrote, "The frontier homestead existed as both physical shelter and symbolic sanctuary in the Western imagination. To transform such a space into a site of calculated murder represented not merely a criminal act, but a transgression against the organizing principles of frontier society itself." This symbolic violation may explain why the community's response to the crimes included not just the execution of the perpetrators, but the complete erasure of their dwelling, the physical dismantling of the house, and the burning of the barn serving as acts of ritual purification. By dispersing and repurposing the materials of the Holloway home, the community was, in Westover's analysis, attempting to neutralize the symbolic contamination by preventing any single structure from embodying the site of transgression. The house where they enacted these betrayals is long gone, its materials scattered and repurposed. The land has been reclaimed by the natural rhythms of the prairie. But the case remains, preserved in dusty archives and academic papers, a reminder that the darkness on the frontier came not just from external threats, but sometimes from the seemingly ordinary people who offered shelter from the gathering night. This duality, the contrast between the Holloway's outward normalcy and their inner depravity, continues to fascinate scholars of criminal psychology. Dr. T. Robert Keller, in his 2010 work Masks of Sanity, Historical Case Studies in Psychopathy, devotes an entire chapter to the Holloway case, arguing that it represents an early documented instance of what we would now recognize as psychopathic behavior. What distinguishes the Holloways from many other murderers of their era, Keller writes, is not the number of their victims or even the method of killing, but their complete emotional detachment from their crimes. They approached murder as a form of resource extraction, no different in their minds from harvesting crops or slaughtering livestock. This clinical approach extended even to their own capture and punishment. According to witness accounts of their execution, both Silas and Martha walked to the gallows with the same measured pace they might have used to cross their farmyard. The Lawrence Daily Journal reported that when asked if he had any last words, Silas simply shook his head, while Martha's only response was to straighten her collar, which had become slightly disarranged as the noose was placed around her neck. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves at the far edge of the Lawrence Cemetery, as far from other burials as the grounds allowed. No funeral service was held, and according to cemetery records, no one has ever visited the graves or requested their location. Unlike their victims, whose families sought closure through proper burial and remembrance, the Holloways passed from life into a deliberate obscurity, their final resting place as isolated as the farm where they conducted their crimes. And sometimes, when the wind blows across the Kansas prairie and rustles through the tall grasses that now cover the site of the Holloway farm, locals say it carries a whisper that sounds almost like an invitation, a soft, insistent voice suggesting that weary travelers might find rest there if only they would step off the path and approach what appears to be a welcoming light in the distance. But no one ever does. The modern highway, with its steady stream of traffic, has replaced the lonely trail where travelers once made fateful decisions about where to seek shelter for the night. The isolated farmsteads that once dotted the landscape have largely given way to larger agricultural operations or been absorbed into expanding urban areas. The Holloway case survives primarily as an academic curiosity, a footnote in the history of frontier crime, occasionally revived through scholarly articles or as a brief mention in broader histories of the region. Its fading from public consciousness might be seen as a mercy, allowing the victim's suffering to recede into the past rather than being continuously revived through retelling. Yet there is value in remembering such cases, if only as a reminder of the complex reality that existed beneath the often romanticized narrative of Western expansion. The frontier was neither wholly heroic nor entirely lawless, but rather a human landscape containing the full spectrum of human potential, for courage and cowardice, for kindness and cruelty, for building communities, and for preying upon the vulnerable. The story of the Holloway farm reminds us that the most dangerous predators were not always those who attacked from outside the boundaries of civilization, but sometimes those who presented themselves as its representatives, offering the false promise of safety to those making the difficult journey across an unforgiving land. As Professor Whitfield concluded in his definitive study of the case, the tragedy of the Holloway victims lies not merely in their deaths, but in the betrayal of the trust that brought them to that fatal threshold, the belief that the light in the window represented sanctuary rather than threat. It is a reminder that the true wilderness the settlers faced was not just the physical landscape, but the uncharted territory of human nature itself. The Kansas prairie continues its seasonal cycles, tall grass rising in spring, golden in summer, burning in controlled fires that renew the soil. The land that once belonged to Silas and Martha Holloway has been reclaimed by these natural processes, the physical traces of their crimes erased by time and intentional forgetting. Yet for those who know the history, who have read the court records or the academic studies, or who have simply heard the stories passed down through generations of Kansas families, that particular stretch of prairie will always be different, a place where the wind carries echoes not just of natural sounds, but of human voices long silenced, travelers who sought only rest and found instead an end to their journey far from home. And perhaps that remembrance, that recognition of lives cut short by calculated evil, is the only memorial the Holloway victims will ever receive. Not carved in stone or marked by plaques, but preserved in the cautionary tales still sometimes told when Kansas families gather and the conversation turns to the early days of settlement, to the lonely farms that once stood as outposts of civilization on the vast prairie, and to the dangers that sometimes lurked behind their welcoming facades.